is Senior Curator of Invertebrate Zoology at the Tasmanian Museum of Art Gallery in Hobart, a position he's held since 2012. He hails from England, but moved to Tasmania with his young family in 2001 to work as a research conservation biologist in forestry. A lifelong naturalist, he is the author of Seasons in the South, a Tasmanian naturalist journey of discovery and recovery, and the Seashells of Tasmania, a comprehensive guide. He's also published widely on Tasmanian natural history and ecology, including research papers and popular articles. Simon regularly chats about Tasmanian invertebrates on local radio, and in 2019 was awarded the Australian Natural History Medallion, the Nobel Prize for Australian naturalists. So please welcome Simon.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for turning up. It's amazing to see so many of you here. I'm delighted that you are. And I'll do my best to fulfil the aims of this presentation, but it's not my usual style of presentation. I'm very comfortable giving talks where I can flick through slides of beetles or beasties or seashells and I can just ad-lib. When it comes to talking about myself, I'm not quite as good at it, so I'm afraid you're going to have to bear with me because I'm actually going to read a fair bit of what I'm going to say. There are going to be slides up there, but they're sort of incidental to what I'm going to say. They're mostly just grabbed off the internet as sort of placeholders for the topics that I'm talking about. So without further ado, let's have a look at autumn in Tasmania. That's just a picture grabbed off the internet from the Derwent Valley. You will have all heard of this, at least the first stanza of this poem by John Keats, Seasons of Mists and Mellow Fruitfulness. And the first stanza at least is very evocative. You just have to say those few words and you can sum up autumn for many of us. But I wonder whether it's as much by association, because we now know it so well that we think already of those associations of autumn as being mists and fruitfulness and so on, rather than the words of the poem itself. If you read the rest of the poem, it's very good, obviously. Keats was recognised as critics as one of the most perfect short poems in the English language, this poem in particular. But I find it hard, I must admit. I find it hard to see through all those words into what he's getting at. But he is a naturalist through and through. This is the third verse of his 3-verse poem. And there's a lot in there that touches on a deep understanding of nature. And a lot of it resonates with me, particularly when it comes to talk about invertebrates like midges and hedge crickets and things like that. He's obviously very in tune with the natural world. It helps for me that he wrote this in the county where I grew up in England as well, so it resonates particularly with me. So, powerful stuff, yeah, perhaps, lyrical, undoubtedly. But the rest of the verse, to me at least, is as much an ode to archaic English as it is to autumn, and seems almost impenetrable to the untrained or unaccustomed modern ear. If I started spouting stuff like that off in the streets of Hobart, I'm not sure what reaction I'd get these days. But Keats does come from a very honourable tradition. In fact, he's probably one of the people that started this tradition of nature writing, either in poem forms or in prose form, in my home, the old country, essentially. Going back to Keats's time, 250 plus years ago, Wordsworth, and this guy, Gilbert White, who some people describe him as the first gentleman naturalist. He wrote his Natural History of Selborne. And Selborne is a village only about 10 miles from where I grew up in England as well, so I have a particular soft spot for him. And his book happens to be the 4th most published book in the English language today still, because it's been almost in constant print in multiple editions since he wrote it back in the late 1700s. So the nature writing genre ticked along over the past couple of centuries, ebbing and flowing, but it's always been there, at least in England and in America. The past decade or so has seen a resurgence in nature writing, and its popularity has grown hugely. And for the most part, I think this is a good thing. And there are some outstanding authors out there, but it also means there's a fair bit of mediocre offerings, shall we say. And I think publishers they're onto a good thing with nature writing these days, and they push out all sorts of stuff, which I find sometimes rather mediocre and unnourishing. That's just me, though. But I did get rather grumpy recently when I bought in the airport recently. I bought a copy of this book called On the Ground with the subtitle Best Australian Nature Writing. And the promotional blurb contains words such as, "This collection makes the perfect summer reading or gift for the nature lover in your life." Well, I would have thought I was a nature lover in my life. And the editor of this book, Dave Whitty, is indeed a gifted nature writer. And many of the included pieces are by well-known authors such as Tim Winton. But I felt very few of the contributions counted as nature writing. I would call them environmental writing, but not nature writing. And the difference, for me at least, is that environmental writing tends to make you feel bad. Bad about the state of the planet, bad about the bad players responsible for the state of the planet, and occasionally bad about our own complicity in the decline of nature. So there's a place for such writing, to be sure, and there's plenty of reasons in today's world to feel bad, but it's not what I want out of nature writing. And my gut feeling is that it may even be worse at eliciting action on behalf of the environment if it leaves one cold rather than in love with the natural world. And I've got the same gut feeling in relation to the conservation movement in Australia. Its message is usually negative and deeply divisive, and it just doesn't work for me, sadly. Anyway, excuse me. What I want out of nature writing is something that makes me feel as if I'm there, experiencing nature through all my senses, as though I were the author or their companion. I want to learn as I go, either through observation or through picking up tidbits of knowledge, learning the backstories of the creatures or the places involved, making connections, and I want the emotional experience of reading to be overwhelmingly positive, engendering a warm glow and ideally a heightened feeling of love towards the natural world. That's what I'm looking for in nature writing anyway. And nature writing and environmentalism can go hand in hand. In Silent Spring, the 1962 book that's credited with kickstarting the environmental movement, Rachel Carson wrote, "It's not half so important to know as to feel. Once the emotions have been aroused, a sense of the beautiful, the excitement of the new and unknown, a feeling of sympathy, pity, admiration or love, then we wish for knowledge about the object of our emotional response. Once found, it has lasting meaning." And it's a beautiful book, Silent Spring, and Rachel Carson's subsequent offerings as well. She really knew how to meld that beautiful writing style with a call to arms on behalf of nature as well, but without being didactic about it and without generally encouraging sort of views of negativity. Which brings me at last to my own offering, Seasons in the South. So the title reflects the seasons-based framework that I chose for the book and its geographical focus on Tasmania. And even though my main aim is to engender learning and a love for Tasmanian nature, I understand that people relate more to a narrative style than to something more didactic, and thus the subtitle of my book, A Tasmanian Naturalist's Journey of Discovery and Recovery, reflects my attempt to weave my own Tasmanian story into the narrative. Now, I've got no pretensions to compare myself to Rachel Carson, Tim Winton, David Whitty or John Keats. I'm just an ordinary naturalist who has in many ways lived a charmed life immersed in the natural world, and who rather later in life got a notion into his head that it was about time to share some of the love. Well, we're not going to the next slide. Okay, I don't have much history as a writer, but I can claim authorship of numerous scientific papers and reports. You can go and look at my ResearchGate profile if you really want to. Mostly on forest ecology, entomology and malacology, that's molluscs. I've also written plenty of articles for journals and magazines on a range of natural history topics. And I did write a book on the seashells of Tasmania. and it's now in its second reprinting of the second edition. But Seasons in the South remains my one and only book offering in the nature writing genre. Okay, I'm going to have a few readings from my book, and this one is how the book starts. Did you hear about the Twin Towers? Yeah, on the news. It's hard to believe. I'd awoken to those words from a deep slumber. They were spoken by two men who happened to be strolling past our unit in Hobart's Battery Point. It was one of our first mornings in Tasmania, and my jet-lagged brain struggled to comprehend their words. Failing, I drifted back to sleep again. Sometime later, I was again woken, this time by the crazed chattering of an unfamiliar bird. Despite my tiredness, I needed to know what it was. I jumped up, donned a dressing gown, staggered to the window and drew the curtains, binoculars at the ready. The glare of a crisp, clear Hobart morning momentarily blinded me, but then, in an ornamental cherry tree, newly adorned with soft pink blossom, I made out a medium-sized songbird as perky and alert as I was befuddled. It sported a black cap, white nape and belly, and grey wings and tail. There was no mistaking the intent of the hooked tip to its bill, nor the menacing glint in its eye. I had become familiar with black butcherbirds doing 3 years in the rainforests of Queensland's wet tropics, and this looked like one of their relatives. Leafing through my well-thumbed Australian bird book, I was startled by the stiff, dry pages almost crackling beneath my touch. It was such an unfamiliar experience after the all-pervading dampness of the tropics. Then I came to it. Bingo! A grey butcherbird. Being able to slot this southern version into a ready-made mental pigeonhole gave me immense pleasure. There was a dash of familiarity in an otherwise unfamiliar land. So, clearly I don't come from a land down under. I come from a land up over. And I guess most of us did at one time. Invaders from the north with our preconceptions of what's up and what's down, what's normal, what's not. And I've learned over the years that these preconceptions apply to the natural world as much as to anything. And I once held my own misconceptions, like the one about Tasmania being an Antipodean England. Okay, that could almost be an Antipodean England, but most of Tasmania clearly is not. Or was it an island wilderness, which is how David Attenborough famously once referred to the place in one of his special TV pieces on Tasmania. That was the opening line: Tasmania, an island wilderness, as though there were no people here. It couldn't really be both, and it didn't take me long to realise that it's neither. These days I bear my own cultural cringe too, not to that faraway mother country so much, but to the indigenous peoples of this invaded land. So this seems like the right time for me to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and to their deep and abiding connections to country. I know I'll never fully belong here. How could I, after all that's gone before in the history of Tasmania? But I've been determined to give it a good try. Local expression, a fair shake of the sauce bottle, or a fair crack of the whip, fair suck of the salve. You're laughing. I don't actually like any of these local Australian expressions, because to me they seem too urban, too hedonistic, too competitive, too violent, too self-centred. My idea of fairness would be something like equal access to the many benefits of being in nature. I should have moved on to this slide. Many of you will be nodding in agreement at this sentiment, but others in our broader society, particularly those who haven't had the benefit of ready access to nature, might wonder what on earth I'm talking about, the benefits of being in nature. But for Indigenous peoples the world over, access to nature is more or less a birthright. In fact, it's almost a nonsensical concept. After all, people are nature, and nature is people. Indigenous cultures recognise that we're all just passing through, and that's a quote I grabbed off the internet, but it's very appropriate, I feel. We're passing through something much bigger than ourselves, something interconnected for all time and across all space. And this anchors us, grounds us, places a weight of responsibility on our shoulders, and motivates us to do the right thing by nature, to tread lightly. But for the rest of us, it seems, there's a growing gulf between the compartmentalised and very unnatural lives that we lead and the lives which we evolved to live, that is, in nature. We almost define our culture by its artificiality, its material wealth, its separateness from nature, its supposed dominion over nature. I work in a museum, and a museum is in some ways a manifestation of this presumption of separateness. By own cultural measures, we're doing extraordinarily well, not necessarily in the museum, but as a society. But my contention is that for all the material benefits we reap through this outlook, on another level, it's doing us no good. In fact, it's doing us and our home on this planet harm. Many of us feel an increasing sense of unease, of disassociation, disconnectedness, though we may not be able to put our finger on the feeling or to understand it. Well, maybe it's time to reconnect with nature, to wake up and literally smell the roses, and that, in essence, is what motivated me to write Seasons in the South. The late evolutionary biologist and general freethinker Ed Wilson popularised the term biophilia for an apparently innate sense that we have of connectedness that we feel when we engage with the natural world. He didn't actually invent the term. It was coined in 1964 by Erich Fromm. He used it to describe a psychological orientation of being attracted to all that's alive and vital. You see it in kids all the time. They're always on the lookout for little beasties, wherever they're walking, or little stones, whatever. And it's why we have gardens, where we make beauty where we can, using nature, natural objects, natural organisms. But most of us don't get a chance to engage very heavily with nature, and many choose not to anyway. And I see this as one of the most tragic aspects of urban society. At the superficial level, the benefits of engagement can be achieved through staring out the office window and glimpsing trees blowing in the breeze. People who are in hospital beds with views of greenness outside the hospital window supposedly recover more quickly than those that just look onto more hospital buildings. Breathing in the aroma of freshly mown lawn, contemplating the sight of a flock of starlings passing overhead, or revelling in the exertion of taking a dog for a walk to the park, or gaining some simple pleasure in feeding a goldfish in its glass bowl. These are all aspects of being in touch with nature. But there's so much more to nature than this, and Ed Wilson pointed out that the benefits to us multiply the more we engage with it. So nature benefits in turn, because what we cherish we're more inclined to respect and to protect. So in U3A, Tasmania, many of us go forth into the wilderness. We're very lucky to be able to do so. The great outdoors. We route march along boardwalks to reach the next hut or campsite before dark. We bush bash through scrub to bag another able. We careen down slopes on skis or mountain bikes. We take the tinny out for a spot of fishing. Nature provides a pleasing backdrop to all of these leisure pursuits. I'm not trying to denigrate these activities, but sometimes, to me at least, they feel like we're passing through nature just a little too quickly. I think there's a lot to be said for taking leisure at, a more leisurely pace, and to diving in deeper. This too is what my book's about. So I write in my book that nature is fractal, I've come to appreciate, like a Mandelbrot set. The closer you look, the more whole new worlds open up in front of you. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but these are repeating patterns. And for me, it's a bit like diving into nature. You go into a forest, first you see the trees, then you look at the leaves on the trees, then you see the beetle on the leaf on the tree, and then you consider the mite on the leg of the beetle on the tree. And so it could go on almost indefinitely. That's a bit psychedelic though, so let's move on. So Seasons in the South then is my invitation to slow down, to avail oneself of all one's senses, to immerse more fully, to notice nature, and through nature to both lose and find ourselves, to become aware of being an integral part of that much bigger picture passing through that's central to the wisdoms more ancient than our own Western tradition. I can't hope to know or explain country, as only one steeped in indigenous culture can, but I feel I have something to offer nonetheless. So my perspective is as one steeped in the venerable but fading Western tradition of the natural historian, harking back to Gilbert White and his Enlightenment peers. And features of this perspective include an inquisitiveness towards the natural world and the desire to understand its workings, informed by hard science but mellowed through personal encounters and softened through what I might call near-spiritual experiences of nature, and at times nature therapy. So in modern parlance, it's a very mindful outlook. The paradox is that we probably wouldn't need nature therapy if we were better connected to nature in the first place. I write, I'm I'm a latecomer to mindfulness in the formal sense of the word, but I think it's something I've practiced almost instinctively for much of my adult life, which is when we all tend to need it the most. If I'm feeling tense, anxious, angry, overwhelmed, or untogether, spending time in nature helps sort me out, reining in the negativity and putting me back together again. It may be a walk in the bush or on the beach, or just sitting quietly somewhere vaguely natural. Initially, my mind is full to bursting with whatever's bothering me, but before long I start to notice the sights, sounds and smells of my surroundings. Our sense of vision dominates, and it's usually something sighted out of the corner of one eye that first draws me in. Are those Tasmanian or brown thornbills skulking in those bushes? Did I just see a cormorant pop up from an instant among the waves over there? Is that a mud dauber wasp making a nest under that rock overhang? I gradually become aware of the sounds of nature next, the quiet contact calls of the thornbills, the lapping of waves against the rocks, the distant mewing of kelp gulls, the wind in the trees, the buzz of wasps and bees, the whine of a mosquito. And the distinct smells, if not of thornbills and insects, and of seaweed, guano, water rat, fungus, leaf mould, flowers, grass, foliage, decaying wallaby. Observing nature is all about being in the moment, quietly, inquisitively, but unobtrusively, not overthinking things, just bathing in the here and now. Closing my eyes, which helps me avoid distractions from this dominant sense, I begin to notice my own sounds and smells, internal gurglings, breathing, nasal whistling, sweating, the pulse in my neck, the heartbeat in my chest, the tingling of the cool breeze on my lips, the flow of air over the hairs on my arms, the pressure of uneven ground on the soles of my feet, the tension in my muscles. And then I realise that whatever negativity I'd felt has dissipated and I feel grounded again. I hope that you can relate to these experiences yourselves as one of the benefits of just being in nature. So I've had the good fortune and immense privilege to be paid to immerse myself in Tasmanian nature for most of my career, both in my current job as curator of invertebrate zoology at TMAG and in the job that I moved to Tasmania to take up back in 2001, which was a research conservation biologist in forestry. And through both my work and my leisure time, I've come to appreciate just how special Tasmanian nature is. Wherever you look and however you look at it, it is a really special corner of the world. My particular lens has been through studying the invertebrates, the other 99% of animal life, as Ed Wilson called them. And he also called them the little creatures that run the world. So they're pretty critical little critters that we often don't even notice. I like to be able to know these creatures at least well enough to name them, and preferably to learn their backstories. That's when they become really interesting. And there are so many of them that I'll never stop learning. But in nature, all things are connected, so I've also learned along the way a lot about forest disturbance dynamics, seashores, biogeography, geomorphology, climate, currents, and especially about deep time here in Tasmania. And I try and squeeze all of these themes into the book too. So when it comes to deep time, here's something I write in my book. Gondwana fires up the nostral imagination. I revel in the thought that so much of our nature traces its ancestry back to this ancient southern supercontinent. While pretty much everywhere can make claims about how special their natural heritage is, I think Tasmania's tangible links with its Gondwanan past, biological, climatological and geological, do make it especially distinct. They certainly contribute to the sense of deep time one feels when immersed in the quiet, dark rainforest. It may be cold and raining, but as you stumble over damp, mossy dolerite boulders alongside a gushing, fern-lined creek, it's not hard to feel as though time has stood still for millions of years. Gondwana is gone, but in Tasmania, its spirit still hangs in the air, feeds the rivers, sculpts the land, and nurtures nature. And of course, I learned a lot about myself, not least through surviving 2 episodes of acute myeloid leukemia while I've been in Tasmania, and about the importance of connectedness among humans too. Above all, I've learnt that, for me at least, access to the natural world is key to a mentally healthy life. And if I hadn't had access to nature in my times of particular need, I doubt I would be here today. Seriously, folks. All these themes are explored in Seasons in the South. For the first decade of my career in Tasmania, I conducted a field of research which I came to call deadwoodology, which was exploring the ecology around once trees die and what lives on dead wood. And there's as much biodiversity, if not more, associated with the dead wood following the tree's death as there is with the living trees. Anyway, if you do that, you become a bit of a detective as to the forest history. So in this book I wrote, for me the rewards of this career weren't merely academic, they were visceral too. It was a privilege to be licensed to spend so much time in the forests, free of the shackles of urban living and office life, and to delve, literally, into an aspect of the forest's functional ecology that few had previously ventured into and where so much awaited discovery. Not every excursion involved majestic old growth. The idea demanded we covered all growth stages, but I particularly enjoyed being in the older forests. These could be experienced at many levels. As a holiday maker would, certainly, marvelling at the cathedral-like works of nature and pondering the vastness of time that went into their creation. You can enjoy a spot of bird watching, green rosellas, yellow-tailed black cockatoos, lyrebirds, scrub wrens, to name but a few. You can get down on your hands and knees and appreciate the smaller plants and animals, the fungi, the mosses, and the liverworts. I enjoy all of these pursuits, but even now I can't stop myself from also engaging in a spot of ecological detective work whenever I find myself in mature wet eucalypt forest. Are all the eucalypts of one age, despite some dominant individuals having twice the girth of others? Or do we have more than one cohort here, signifying a non-standard place in wildfire? Which age classes of trees bear fire scars or signs of charring on their trunks? How old does that dogwood stand? Because that tells you when the last fire went through, because dogwood seeds in the soil germinate after fire. How did that blackwood get to grow so tall and straight when open-grown blackwoods are short and branchy? A tall, straight growth form signifies that it grew up in competition with other young trees and shrubs, probably in a gap in the forest, which it eventually came to dominate. Are those logs of the same tree species as the present stand would indicate? Did they arise as a result of self-thinning of a developing eucalypt stand, or did fire, disease, or a windstorm topple the trees from which they were derived? How old are those rainforest saplings that are growing out of that log, and what does that say about how long the log's been lying there? Why is that patch of eucalypts over there so much younger than around here? A past spot fire, perhaps? Why is the foliage on that myrtle branch withered and brown? Perhaps it's myrtle wilt, which entered via a wound caused by a side strike from a branch falling from one of its neighbours. Thinking this way helps me to get the measure of a forest, to understand its disturbance history, its trials and tribulations, its achievements in the face of adversity. It engenders a sense of respect, but also of impermanence. Come back in 5 or 50 years and it might look rather different. In 500 years it would be unrecognisable. Okay, and so now to autumn. Even now in my mind, March should almost be spring, because it was always spring in March when I was growing up in England. It's taken me decades to come to terms with this seemingly banal upending, but now I've embraced it. And in fact I decided to use the seasons as the main framework for my book. Admittedly, these are western seasons of spring, summer, autumn and winter, and each month or month gets its own chapter, featuring seasonally appropriate vignettes of encounters with Tasmanian nature. So these are the illustrations that accompany the chapters on March and April in my book. Into this framework I weave my own journey of discovery, spanning 2.5 decades. And there's an interlude chapter halfway through where I pause to relate my leukemia experiences and the role that nature played in my recovery. So what do I love about autumn in Tasmania? Well, perhaps you're expecting me to wax lyrical about the turning of the fagus, the crispness of our frosty mornings, auroras, bioluminescence, the Bridgewater jerry, the departure of swallows, the late flight season of our endemic and threatened to narrow brown butterfly, the end of daylight saving. Well, I do indeed dwell on all of these topics in my book, but here I'd like to read about one of those idiosyncratic beasties which, for me, give autumn in Tasmania a unique flavour and exemplify many of those concepts that I find so fascinating here. So I offer you the southern snowflea. And this is what I write in my book about southern snowfleas. Several years went by before I went on my own snowflea hunt with my young son Ben. His near vision was so much better than mine, and I rated his chance of finding one much higher than mine. I chose a clear afternoon in early May, and we drove to the summit of Kunanyi, since Mount Wellington is a type location from which the species was originally described, back in 1941. It was a mild day down below, but on the mountaintop it was only about 5 degrees. Fortunately, there was little wind chill, and the only clouds about drifted by at a comfortable height above our heads. So, in puffer jackets and beanies, we walked a couple of 100 metres along the main track across the plateau, then got down on our hands and knees among the alpine shrubs to begin the hunt. I thought that it would be easy to find stones to turn and patches of leaf litter to sift, but I was wrong. Most stones were either too deeply embedded or too large, and leaf litter was sparse and intermingled with the prickly shoots of the shrubs. For 20 minutes there were no signs of snow fleas or any other insect life. A change of tactic was called for, so I reached out and lifted the prostrate branches of a shrub which had spread out across the surface of a large boulder. Where the outer branches had lain there was no debris, but nearer the base, a shallow layer of shed leaves and twigs had accumulated over many years. This merged below into crumbly humus. The first boulder turned up no insects, but repeating this technique, I found my first southern snow flea within a few minutes. I was surprised that Ben hadn't found one himself, so I called him over to take a look. Before us was a strange-looking beast, more like a minuscule cricket or a giant wingless aphid than a flea, purply brown with spindly black legs, a bulbous abdomen, downward-pointing mouthparts and long wispy antennae. Though it didn't seem capable of hopping, it walked off towards the base of the shrub within which I disturbed it at quite a pace, given how cold the weather was. To prevent it from disappearing, I scooped it up in my hand so that Ben and I could examine it more closely. My hand must have warmed it up because it became even more determined to flee. Conceding defeat, I introduced it to a sprig of shrub and it clambered about among the branchlets. This won me enough time to take a few photos before returning it to whence it came. We persevered with our search for another 20 minutes or so, but by then the cold had thoroughly sapped our enthusiasm, so we decided that one snow flea was reward enough. But why do I call them snow fleas rather than scorpion flies? Although they're part of the scorpion fly insect order, they resemble neither scorpions nor flies, nor the original scorpion flies for that matter. Indeed, they lack both wings and an obvious tail. But fleas? Well, in the northern hemisphere there's a boreal scorpion fly lineage whose members are widely known as snow fleas. Like ours, they're flightless and they're active during the northern autumn and winter. They look rather more flea-like than ours and they can hop, but in many respects they're similar to ours. In fact, it's quite uncanny how these two flea-like, cold-adapted lineages have evolved independently at opposite ends of the planet, each from fully winged scorpion fly ancestors. Ours aren't part of the northern snow flea lineage though, so I think it's sensible to call them southern snow fleas. Austral snow fleas might be another option. As it happens, there's long been discussion in entomological circles about whether the true fleas, the blood-sucking kind, originated as a highly specialised fly that lost its wings and developed a taste for blood, or as an equally specialised sort of scorpion fly. For some, the argument is moot because scorpion flies and true flies are sister groups sharing a common ancestor. All this evolutionary divergence happened long ago, so it's hard to reconstruct the ordering of events, even with the evidence of DNA. But two recently published studies, conducted independently but published simultaneously, have suggested that the true fleas are highly modified scorpion flies. In other words, this means that there are actually three known lineages of scorpion flies that look flea-like: the true fleas, the northern snow fleas, and the southern snow fleas. And in case you're tempted to think that the true fleas evolved from the snow fleas, the DNA evidence, based in part on specimens that I contributed, suggests that this isn't the case. Counterintuitively, the closest living scorpion fly relative of the true fleas are the lacy-winged nanochoristids, which are another denizen of Tasmania's cold country. I suspect this isn't the final word on the tangled tale of flea evolution, but in the meantime, I'm content to marvel at the ingenuity of ever-inquisitive humans, and all the more at the unexpected twists and turns that evolution takes through deep time. So I guess you get a gist for my writing style in that book, where I do like to impart knowledge, but I'll try and do it in a narrative style so that you almost don't realise you're learning as you go. I could equally have read to you about Tasmania's endemic, silent, nocturnal, hairy cicadas that emerge in the autumn, and in doing so seemingly break all the cicada rules, yet which are close to the ancestral cicada and so play by older rules. These guys here, they can't sing, they come out at night, they tap their feet rather than singing, they don't feed, they're very uncicada-like in many ways, although they do look very like cicadas. but their lineage is older than the true cicadas, so these are like the ancestral cicadas, and they're only found in this part of the world. I could have read to you about Tasmania's endemic flightless soldier fly, up on the top right there, whose wingless females, more walk than fly, lug their distended egg-filled bodies across the manicured lawns of suburbia, their larvae feeding underground on grass roots. You've probably seen these in your backyard at times. So these appear among some 80 vignettes in total, each a meandering narrative themed loosely around encounters with one or more of Tasmania's special creatures, special environments, or both. I wish there'd been room for 800 rather than 80, as there's so much to share, so much to know, so much to ponder. I do a fair bit of pondering in the book, so here's a bit more, this time of an evolutionary nature. So crouching on that rock platform by the sea, wedged between the crumbling fossiliferous mudstone cliff and a sea once again teeming with marine life, I found myself contemplating how different the world might have been today if there had been no end Permian mass extinction. Would the brachiopods have continued to dominate and evolve into seafloor giants, or life forms capable of colonising the land? Perhaps the mammals would have gained ascendancy over the reptiles 100 million years earlier than they did. If so, there might have been no dinosaurs, hence no birds. There would almost certainly be no humans today. Maybe some other animal lineage would have evolved into a physically and mentally dexterous, human-like creature instead, and beaten us to it by millions of years. Luckily for us, we'll never find out. I brushed my fingers mindfully over the delicate ridges and troughs outlining the imprints of the ribbed brachiopod fossil, experiencing a brief moment of deep connection with that lost world, which was so distant in time, it existed right here in the very spot where I now crouched. And I had something to say about middens as well, or more correctly referred to as living places. I scrambled up the slope again through well-established protective plantings of pig-faced saltbush and she-oak, and turned to face the river, trying to imagine what it must have been like in pre-European times, when the midden in front of me was actively being added to. Was there ceremony or reverence involved, perhaps recognising that the shells represented a visible manifestation of intergenerational continuity? Or were the discards cast aside as casually as we would do today? I conjured up the sounds of children playing, perhaps skimming stones on the water, while adults contentedly stoked the fire and cracked open the freshly steamed turbans or warreners, sharing stories or jokes as they worked, played and ate. Perhaps women were crafting shell necklaces. Rainbow kelp shells or maronniers, a favourite, are still common locally. Or maybe they were arguing, irritable, sitting there half-starved, with teeth chattering in the cold. Life has never been all fun and games. So my own journey of discovery continues to this day, of course, as probably all of ours does, and it's never been a linear affair. And in particular, mine's been punctuated by 2 episodes where my life was on pause due to ill health. Now, some people choose to block out memories of the bad times, but I decided to write mine down, since notwithstanding the lifesaver medical treatment I received, I feel that being in nature was really a critical part of my mental recovery, and this is a core theme of the book. I probably haven't got time to read too much of this, but I'll just touch on it. Then after the 3rd round of chemo, brutal as all the others, came the news that we'd all been holding out for. The leukemia had gone. My chances of surviving the next 5 years, which had initially hovered at around 40%, were now substantially higher. My 6-month convalescence was slow and steady. I had been given special leave by my very accommodating employer and scarcely gave my forestry work a second thought, despite it having dominated my life just months before. In fact, I had little appetite for dwelling on the past, nor for contemplating the future. Life became a sort of suspended animation, a bubble of here and now. As autumn turned to winter, I was less inclined to lounge around in a hammock in the garden, and I took to gentle outdoor exercise instead. At first, my atrophied muscles would scarcely carry me to the beach and back, all of 400 metres. But in time I regained strength, and I would practice walking up and down the steep steps leading to the cliff-top path at the far end of the beach. Reaching the top, I would take a lengthy rest on the bench conveniently located there. I came to know the beach intimately, and those steps, and the bench, and the short section of coastal path above them. I found myself tuning into every little change that marked the progression of the seasons, and equating these steps towards my own recovery. There was always something to watch, smell, or hear. The day-by-day gradual decay of fallen leaves, The sudden appearance and distinctive musty odour of toadstools, rainwater trickling down the steps, the subtle variations in the calls that songbirds used to express their own changing relationships with the seasons, the daily rhythm of the tides, the ever-changing seascapes and skyscapes, which kept time with the weather's moods through a never-ending cycle of ridges, troughs and fronts. These were commonplace events that most of us completely overlook in our busy lives, but for me, at this one time, they were my life. And from my perspective, it was though the beach, the sea, the cliffs, the woodland, all of nature was gradually embracing me and making me part of its daily existence, as it was part of mine. On the beach, the silver gulls watched my shuffling daily progression through beady, red-rimmed yellow eyes. They soon learnt that I was no threat to them, so they would sidestep out of my way rather than taking flight. A female pink robin took up residence for the autumn and winter in the strip of undergrowth between the cliff-top path and the cliff edge. She was seldom visible but often audible, making a gentle tuck-tuck, whispered rather than sung. I felt that she too had come to accept my daily presence as part of her own estimate of place. Her quiet calls seemed like ones of recognition, neither a tut of disapproval nor a tick of approval. On another walk I had an uncanny feeling that I was being watched, a feeling triggered perhaps by an unusual lull in a soundscape that was normally filled with birdsong. I turned and glimpsed a pure white goshawk eyeing me warily from a branch halfway up a blue gum. I can honestly say now and with great conviction that nature contributed enormously to my full and speedy recovery. How can I be so sure of nature's significance with a sample size of 1? Well, that's because a few years later the sample increased to 2 when my leukemia returned, and this time I didn't have such ready access to nature. So that's because I had to move to Melbourne for a bone marrow transplant. So what I write about that experience is that for me the hardest part of the whole post-transplant recovery period was not being able to escape into nature, restorative, nurturing nature. During those long weeks in Melbourne, the best part of my day was falling asleep and the worst part was waking up again. For weeks I suffered from severe fatigue and scarcely had the strength to walk around our city block, let alone venture further afield. In any case, I wasn't allowed to do so initially because of the risk of picking up an infection from airborne dust or spores, which is pretty sad that nature might have killed me. Anyway, in due course we hired a wheelchair so that Chris, my wife, could push me along the busy streets to Royal Park, which is that, where we'd do slow laps of the main jogging and dog walking circuit. After a while I could walk the laps without assistance, and eventually I could walk to the park as well as around it, albeit with frequent rests. Royal Park is expansive, and we could at least experience greenery and bird calls, but skyscrapers always loomed large on the horizon. We were never out of earshot of road traffic and sirens. Traffic helicopters hovered more or less continuously overhead, and planes rumbled, drones buzzed, and dogs yapped. Though these walks were the highlight of the day, they did not nourish me, and I found myself descending into a spiral of despondency, doom and despair. In later weeks, as I was eased off the immunosuppressants, our horizons expanded. We got to visit the beach at St Kilda and to meet up with friends living in the city's outer suburbs. The company and destinations were great, but the journeys, often along tens of kilometres of soulless, congested urban motorway, were anything but. If Melbourne was considered one of the most livable cities in the world, a gold standard for urban living, I deeply pitied the billions of people around the world for whom a city park at best was the closest they could get to nature. Perhaps you don't miss what you don't know, or perhaps I simply lack the necessary resilience for city living. Either way, I was enormously relieved when I was at long last deemed fit enough to fly back to Hobart and continue my convalescence at home. My homecoming came not a moment too soon. So, later I write that transplant trauma had left me feeling like I'm damaged goods, and I've got a different perspective on life subsequent to my illness. I'm more inclined to brace the Roman poet Horatius's maxim that was written up there, carpe diem quam minimum credula postero, he wrote, which is broadly translates as seize the day because you can't put much faith in the future. Or my motto has really become more crudely, carpe the diem before the diem carpes you. I'm still up for some good old-fashioned middle-class delayed gratification, but not at the expense of making the most of the present. And how do I do that? Through getting out into nature, of course, whatever the season and almost whatever the weather. I I'm going to skip a couple of slides there because I realise I'm going on a bit. But I did do a lot of my writing out in the bush, and we're very lucky that when my mother-in-law died, she bequeathed enough money for us to buy a camper van, which we named after her. This is Norma, the camper van. So I did a lot of writing in the Tarkine and other places in Norma. And while I was writing, I'd been admiring the artistic skills of Dover-based nature artist Keith Davis, who'd been sharing some of his sketches on Facebook. And so I sent him my developing manuscript and asked if he'd be willing to illustrate the book. And I was really thrilled when he said yes, and on very generous terms too. So over the following year, his output was prolific. He produced 12 colour plates and 80-odd individual line drawings. Do I have those here? No, not there. All of which appear in the book, including on the front cover. I'll put a slideshow up of these when I finish this talk. People often pick up the book and comment on its beauty, to which I say, always judge a book by its cover. And I also add, well, if you like the illustrations, which is the bit I didn't do, imagine what the writing's like. 40 South published the book. Did I choose them or did they choose me? Well, we chose each other, really. And they chose an outstanding editor in Daniela Brozek, who saw the potential in what I produced and deftly and diligently edited my manuscript. So in the latter part of the book, I increasingly allow my prose to turn to matters philosophical, reflect on my own journey towards understanding my place in the world. I reflect on the damage I've done to nature through my living, and to some extent at least I come to terms with the reckoning. My forestry research required trees to be felled and thousands of insects to be trapped. My current job oversees the conservation of hundreds of thousands of dead animals, mostly deliberately killed. My international flights to visit family coming across the climate. Each of us is a complicated bundle of contradictions and hypocrisy, and despite my good intentions, I'm no exception. But change is coming, and much of it isn't going to be good, either for us or for nature. We can get angry about this, or we can speak and act with love and compassion. I deliberately chose love over anger in my writing about Tasmanian natural world, because I feel anger wins few friends, and I'm too old to spend my days in anger. The choice we have is whether we accept an inglorious fate for ourselves and the natural world, or whether we put our minds to living better lives that do less harm, or who knows, may even do some good. The concept of posterity is key here. The word encapsulates the idea of that which will be behind us. It's a good word, posterity. It should be used more. It's a way of looking to the future with an expectation of hindsight. What would we like to leave behind us for our descendants and for the natural world that they will inherit and will, I hope, be an integral part of? I probably haven't got time to quote much more from my book on the matter, so I'll probably skip, but I do mention that why should the golden rule only apply between humans? What about humans and the natural world? I do write that Pope Francis once said that God always forgives. Human beings sometimes forgive, but nature never forgives. I beg to disagree. Nature may sometimes deliver shocks and catastrophes that affect millions, yet as a whole, the planet only remains habitable because nature keeps it so. And in this regard, nature is the epitome of forgiveness and benevolence. Nature cares little whether we're optimistic or pessimistic about its future, but it does matter maturely to nature whether we feel love and care for it, and grief, guilt and fear at its loss. I think I had better wind up. Perhaps I'll just read. Okay. I am going to wind up. This was more about the concept of biophilia and the fact that we can consider ourselves either part of nature or apart from nature. And I've written the book as though we're not part of nature, because if we assume we're part of nature, then we can justify all sorts of terrible things that we're doing on the planet, because it's all natural. But on the other hand, we are part of nature, and these illustrations, which I grabbed off the internet, sort of show it quite nicely. We're totally dependent on nature. Nature's now totally dependent on us. We should embrace that idea. So, in summing up, if I were to be granted one wish for my readership, and indeed for all of humanity, why not? It would be this. It would be, may we all pass through this life and this very special place with dignity, humility, respect, and above all, with love for all that surrounds and nurtures us. That is the natural world. And on a slightly more banal level, I'll leave you with this little bit from my book. There is pleasure to be found in all weather if you're properly prepared. Enjoy your cheeks tingling with a wetting by winter rain, or an upper body massage courtesy of a pummeling westerly gale, or the bushwalker's simple satisfaction of a steaming hot cuppa poured from a thermos. For those who don't mind delayed gratification, there's the satisfying inner glow that comes following a brisk walk in the rain, sleet or snow. As Billy Connolly once advised, there's no such thing as bad weather, just the wrong clothing. So get yourself a sexy raincoat and live a little. That's it. So I did say I'll just show the illustrations that Keith put together. So these are just on a rotation, but I'm very happy to take any questions while these are showing. I hope these are showing. They're not showing. Why are they not showing? Okay. I think these will just go through automatically. And those are the vignette titles in my book for each of these chapters, within each of these chapters. Is it going to do something? Anyway, happy to take any questions or comments.
Simon, we have met before.
Yeah.
I'm Rosie, the girl who gave me the fun of smile.
I do remember.
But yeah, I was thinking that I would like to know, and it seems a bit negative based on your very positive comments. Have you noticed, being an expert on seashells, if there's been any change as the water temperature has gone up around the east coast of Tasmania? I talk about the destruction of the kelp forest people on my tours, but I was wondering if you'd noticed that if there was any significant change in the size, or maybe how many of the seashells that you used to see and are now not seeing so many.
I probably don't go to the East Coast beaches regularly enough to be able to comment, but my local beach of Taroona definitely have noticed a big change. I've recorded 350 mollusk species from Taroona, but if I went to walk along the beach these days, I'd be lucky to find a couple of dozen on any particular day. I don't know whether it's declining mollusks or more people collecting or changing local currents not depositing them as much, but I suspect there's a big thing going on. I suspect it's also happening elsewhere. Yeah. Don't be shy.
I guess the big question is, your book looks beautiful. Did you bring any copies of them to sell?
What do you think these boxes here are? Since you mention it. Yes, I do. And the retail price is $59.95, but I can sell them here on the spot for $55, and I'll sign them and whatever. I can take card or cash as well.
Thank you, Simon. In the same way as the question came about seashells, have you anything to comment about the insect life?
Yeah.
The kind that used to be steered across that windscreen
Yeah.
decades ago, who drove at night?
Yeah, it's a big question, and we're really not monitoring these things well enough to have a definitive answer. So it's all anecdotal. Yes, there is an insect apocalypse because there's a nature apocalypse. I don't think there's anything particularly inexplicable about insect declines. I think it's all standard things like loss of habitat, pesticides, agricultural intensification, urbanisation. Perhaps the additional thing for insects is artificial light, because that really disrupts their breeding. So there are, and of course global warming. Yeah. So yes, there's a nature apocalypse going on. It was.
too more prosaic than every question. I'm really keen to go to and I'm really keen to go to forest. Something she said about this is the autumn colours of the beach. I've got any suggestions to say to focus you're out there.
Well, you can see it from the road on the Lake Dobson Road up at Mount Field. That's a pretty good place, and there are places you can pull over just by the road and see it. And there's a short walk close to Lake Fenton. Lake Fenton, which is again on that Lake Dobson Road. Yeah. You're welcome.
I think that is it, Simon, in terms of questions. Your books are available for sale.
I can take them up if you can have tea up there.
We'll take them out to the front desk if anyone would like to buy one, which would be great. Thank you very much, Simon, for that deeply personal narration. I think your writing style is poetic, is beautiful, and I think you have touched us very much with your words and certainly allowed us to reflect. So on behalf of U3A, thank you very much for coming here this morning and a little memento.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for bearing with me as I've resorted to reading so much of it.